this gentleman. He is my uncle. I'm very proud. His name is Roy Francis. He is an author of 2 books. He is a promoter and the former BBC producer of an award-winning program, which we'll talk about a bit later. So this man has so much history, and I'm so grateful for him because his story is my story. He's my relative. So really excited to have you on, Uncle. I think I was waiting for the time, but I knew the book was coming out, and this was the perfect time to have a chat. But first I want to ask how you're doing. We're obviously in a very uncomfortable and unprecedented season. And how are you? Are you well? I know that you're well, but it's always good to ask and not just to assume.
Yeah, thank God I'm fine. We're fine, and everybody in the family is fine. Thank God. I keep telling everybody at the same time not to be complacent. Yeah. The news at the moment is not terribly good. I think they're talking about just under 100,000 people, is it per day, or during the season is tested positive. That this second spike might be worse than the first. So it's important that we adhere to all the social regulations, you know, wash hands, face mask, and social distances, just to give ourselves a chance, basically.
I think so.
So
I think, you know,
we're fine. Thank God for that.
Yeah, no, that's the most important thing. Like every day, my family is in my prayers. So, you know, that's the most important thing. And you just have to give thanks and just, as I said, be sensible, listen to the science, wash your hands, and just protect yourself and protect others, because sadly we could be carrying and we don't know. So we have to be very careful. But someone said Sir Roy, and I think that is the correct one to call you. Sir Roy, someone said. I think it's Albert Mans. I'm not sure who that is. I reckon it looks familiar.
Albert. Oh, hello. Oh, he's from Zimbabwe. He's got a fantastic group. I worked very closely with him one time. Yes. It's a great artist. Great artist. Wonderful
artist.
That's
fantastic. Oh, lovely to meet you, sir. And yes, You've got a history, Uncle, an amazing history. I just want to introduce you again for some guests that have joined. This is a gentleman called Roy Francis, and he's here to talk about a book he has out at present. He's got a long history, and you're going to definitely be entertained and inspired. I've read the book, and it's very, very insightful. I know a lot about my history, but there was parts that I didn't understand, and it really filled in the gaps of my knowledge about our journey as people of color, the Windrush, a story that is still going on right now, and the transatlantic slave trade in America and in the Caribbean, which is very different, but we'll go into that in more detail. So, Uncle, my question is, what was the journey? You came from Jamaica to England. So let's go back as a child.
Well, it's quite interesting. I remember a little bit, not too much, to be honest with you, my early upbringing in Jamaica, because I came to England when I was 7 or 8. Yeah. So the early years in Jamaica is a little bit foggy, to be honest with you. And the journey from Jamaica to here, I don't remember anything whatsoever. I remember that our grandparents got us dressed one day and say we're going away to meet our parents. And that's as much as I remember. A van came to the house. We used to call it yard in those days. A van came. My brother and myself and my uncle got into this van, and that's all I remember. I don't remember traveling to Kingston. I don't remember the airport. I don't remember getting on a plane. I don't remember landing. I don't remember arriving in London. All I remember is when we reached our parents' home in North London, and that's my brother and myself, was introduced to our parents because they had left 3 years earlier to come to England and left us with our grandparents, your great-grandparents. And I remember my father took me to the top of the street. There was this little kiosk, and he bought me a bar of chocolate. I have never forgotten that, although I cannot remember anything before that. Isn't that amazing? My brother, your uncle, your other uncle, Samai, he remembers every single thing and every detail, and he's 2 years younger than me.
So so Uncle Samai came, you all went, so you both came together, is that correct?
Yes, we both came together. Yeah,
Oh.
with our uncle, or who has since died. The uncle attached Rene, the one who lived in Canada for many years. He's the
Yes.
one who brought Uncle Sam and myself to England to meet our
Oh,
parents.
wow. And so you've been away from grandma and granddad for 3 years. So we hear the
Yes, yes.
stories. A lot of kids are brought up by their grandparents. And how did that feel? Because that's a long time to be away and then be taken to this strange country that you've heard about, but very different to Jamaica.
Well, it's interesting because my grandparents, I thought, were my parents because I called them Mama and Papa.
Oh.
Yes, so as far as I was concerned, they were my parents. They told us that we've got a parents abroad, and my parents, mum and dad, would send us things, clothes, and send money and things for us. But that didn't mean anything because who was looking after us, who was loving us, who was caring for us were our grandparents. And as far as I was concerned, as far as we were concerned, they were our parents. They were Mama and Papa. When we got to England, now that's my brother and myself, we had to learn that these are our parents, my mother and father, and we had to build a relationship with them. It's quite interesting when I look back at this. I wasn't so conscious of it at the time, but looking back at it, that's what happened. Not because we're children, we slipped into it very quickly. It was nothing traumatic. I mean, now today people make big drama over something like that, but a lot of young people, young children, my generation, that was their experience, and they went through that, and that's nothing unusual, to be honest with you.
And then obviously, being from Jamaica, there's certain cultural aspects of being Jamaican. I've been brought up, yes, I'm Black British, but my culture, my upbringing is very Caribbean, whether it comes to the food, the discipline, things like that. Did you see a difference being in England at the early stages, or was you kind of cocooned because you're just trying to make sense of it all?
We were cocooned. We weren't terribly conscious what was going on. We were in a home, in a family. The food was no different really in the early stages because we ate Jamaican food. It was hard to get. Now I realize that it was difficult to get Jamaican food, but we ate it. And if it weren't strictly Jamaican food, it was cooked in a Jamaican way. So we didn't see any real difference in it. And the home was very Jamaican. It's quite interesting, your grandparents, it's back your granddad was quite an interesting man, Rene, because he wouldn't allow us to speak patois in the house. But he and your grandma, spoke patois all the time.
All the time.
All the
That's
time.
unfair.
Now, his rationale for that was that in order to get ahead in British society, you need to understand and you need to be able to speak the language articulately and proper. It would get you places. But at the same time, he was conscious that we shouldn't lose our own culture. Hence the reason that patois was forever in the house, but we weren't allowed to speak it. We internalized it. We heard it all the time. But the emphasis was on standard English so that we could stand a chance within the society. I thought it was quite clever, actually, of him. But I only realized that later on in life.
And then, obviously, schooling. Was there a lot of people of colour in the schools? I mean, I know we've been here before in Britain, but was there like 3 people, 2 people? Or what was that like? Schooling, did they
well, let me talk about secondary school. Secondary school is quite interesting because we're the first generation and the first wave of black boys. In my school, it was all boys school, to school in Britain from the Caribbean. I remember our school had about 1,000 boys, 1,200. There was only about 4 of us in the whole school, 4 or 5 in the whole school. There was no such thing as a black teacher, not anywhere in the school. There's only 4 of us. And as I say in the book, it was quite interesting. The racism, the overt racism in school was just extraordinary. In the book, I didn't want to go into the types of racism to overt, what the name calling and all that kind of stuff, because so much have moved on. But it was nothing for teachers to just, it is abused when I think of it now, just to spurt out racial racism at will and at infinitum without batting an eyelid. They do it in the class, right in front of all the pupils, do it outside. For them, it was just normal. I give you one example. I've not mentioned the book because I didn't want to. Back in the days, the winters were so cold. And at the back of this is the old LCC buildings, the old LCs, London County Council buildings, they were called. Old school, you see these old school buildings, it's one of those, none of these modern stuff. Think anything built up before 1900, those type of buildings. And they used to have these big radiators at the back, and the school was very, very cold because the radiators weren't terribly efficient and the whole heating system wasn't efficient. So brought me a little black boy from the Caribbean, felt the cold more than anybody else. So I used to snuggle up these radiators before the teacher. The teacher used to come into the classroom after the pupils had arrived in the classroom and sat down to wait on the teacher. And I used to sit on top of this radiator and just to keep warm, to be honest. And as soon as the master came, they used to wear gowns. To be Francis, get out of the branches. What? Just like that.
Oh, you are kidding me.
Day in, day out, he didn't bat an eyelid.
Wow.
It was just normal. Goodness. That cannot happen today. There's no teacher in British school would last a day if they were to repeat anything like that. So we've come a long way, but let me say that the racism still exists, but it's now institutionalized. It's systematic. It's in the institution. It's in the systems within the different institutions in this country. But having said that, the school standard was very high. We had to achieve, no matter who we are. And it's left an abiding love of knowledge, love of learning. As you know, I love classical music. I trace my love of classical music and my love of hymns from school. Because in those days we had assembly every morning at school and every evening just before you go home. This assembly's twice a day. It's like the public school. And we had a pipe organ in school. So we always sang hymns. So hence my love of hymns. And we were obliged to attend music lessons where we sat and listened to classical music. At the beginning, as I said in the book, I didn't know what this music stuff was about. It washed over me. But there was one piece of music that captured my attention. It's called The Trout by Schubert, number 5. And it had a tune. And because I played the piano back in those days, it resonated with me, and I began to listen a little bit more intently. And that's the genesis of my love of classical music.
Wow. And then I'm going to let you tell the world, but you were one of the first, and you can tell me about this story, to be in the first UK gospel group in the UK.
That's correct, yeah.
So how did that happen? I mean, how did Granddad take it, I would ask?
Well, that's a good question. There was this group, how it happened, and again, it's in the book, is that this group had formed. They were called the Soul Seekers, and they were making a big wave on the church circuit, the Black Pentecostal Church circuit. Everybody wanted this group in their church and at their service and their special services. And they came to our church, your granddad's church, and they saw me playing because I used to play for all the services like your father did after me. And they saw me playing, and they were making changes to the group because the lead singer, Tony Tribe, had left. And Tony Tribe is the guy who sang Red, Red Wine, first singer of Red, Red Wine, which Simply Red, no, not Simply Red, is it? Oh, no, UB40. Is it UB40? UB40. Yeah, he's the first person who recorded Red, Red Wine as a reggae song, which UB40 did later on and made a massive hit of. Anyway,
correct.
so Tony Tribe had left the group. The Soul Seekers decided they wanted a change of group. They wanted to include a keyboard player. So they asked my father if I could join them. He said no, and naturally.
Yeah.
Quite interesting. He said he didn't bring his children to England to be entertainers, quote
Oh,
unquote.
dear. Yeah.
Oh dear. So that meant, as far as he's concerned, it was education, 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 and more education.
Yep.
So the disappointment was so strong. I was so disappointed. I was so cut up by it, because this, I mean, it's like joining a big pop group today.
It's like being part of the Jacksons.
Or something like that. Yeah. And my mother obviously cottoned on to this, and she quietly said to me, leave it to me. Now, people don't know how powerful Caribbean mothers can be, because they're the ace strategist. She said, leave it to me. And I remember one time I asked her, but she said, didn't I say leave it to me?
Yeah.
And somehow, I don't know what she did, but I know it must have been her. She convinced my father for me to join the group. So I joined the group, and I had a great time with them. We went abroad. We were in Norway, Belgium, France, the Scandinavian countries. Back in those days, we were playing before audiences of 10, 15, 20,000 people back in those days.
Wow.
In Scandinavia, and made the news and made the papers every time we played. The first time I signed an autograph in my life was in Sweden. And I'm talking early. This is the early 60s. So that's how I came into the group, the Soul Seekers, the first gospel group in this country.
That's amazing. And then, as Granddad wanted, you did continue to study, and you educated yourself and went to university.
Yes, I did.
Somehow.
Yeah.
So you did the music, but you still kept on the goal. Yes. And what did you study? What did you study at university? Or what university did you go to? I can't remember.
Politics. I did politics. Now the thing is, yes, I went to university. I wanted to go to university. Really, really, so much, because somewhere along the line, in the third year of my schooling, a master, Dr. Hodges, never forget him, he told the class that at our age we should be reading the Times.
Oh, wow.
And he said, go and buy the Times. And I didn't even know what the Times were. I thought the man was talking about watch or something. Anyway, I started to read. I bought the Times and started to read the Times and began to politicize myself. And of course, this was the time of the Labour Party being in government since after the war in 1964 with Harold Wilson. And this was a new age and a new dawn, and the Beatles, and all you need is love, and the white heat of technology and a new age, and everything was just wonderful. And here I was, I said, I want to go to university. So what was good about the group, joining the group, I got that out of my system, because there was a dual influence in my life. One was music and one was education. So once I'd got music out of my system in that regard, I'd been there, done some of the things I was hoping and wanting to do, and was happy with that. I think, right, let me do university, let me do schooling now, let me do education now. So I thrust into that with all the vigor that I had, and ended up at university and was studying politics for 3 years. University of Leicester.
Okay. That's amazing. And then you had a stint of being a teacher, which is one of the most respectable professions, I must add, that gives back to society. And that must have been very interesting. What was the year group that you looked after? Was it secondary, if I remember rightly?
Yeah, it was two things. Prior to that, after university, your granddad always insisted that we must give something back to society. That was his big thing. Not go and make money, but make a contribution to society. So I felt incumbent after university to go and work in the community. So I went in work in Brixton, and I was part of an education project in Railton Road called the Melting Pot, very famous educational project, and worked there for 2 years, and saw a job advertised to go and teach in Africa. And I applied for it, got the job, and I went off to Zambia and taught in Zambia, way down in a place called the Luapula province. Now that's deep, deep Zambia.
Wow.
And taught there for 4 years. That's the making of me, if ever. I don't fuss about anything. I'm not rash about anything, because the thing is about Africa, it teaches you patience. If you're waiting for a bus, Rene, the bus is going to come. They tell you the bus is coming, and Mr. Also, who's watching this, Obert, who's watching this, he'll know what I'm saying. Bus is going to come at 6 o'clock in the morning. You get up at 5 o'clock, you go wait for it. The bus turns up at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. You don't move. You sit at the wayside. You sit at that side. And then you get on a bus and it travels for about 3 hours, then it stops. By the time, it travels again for another couple of, then it's nighttime. You haven't reached where you're going yet. Oh, no. And everybody's turfed off the bus. And you just got to find your own way and do what you can until the next morning. So wow. It was just those experiences and others, and it was just a wonderful, hard discipline of life. It taught me so much, and I'm so grateful for it. I spent 4 years there teaching, and education is so respected. In Africa, so respected. So the pupils are so keen. I mean, Tash, I call you Tash, Rene.
It's okay. Everyone knows. Just so I can explain, my surname is Francis. My legal name is Natasha, and my middle name is Rene. So my name, which I've been given by birth, is Rene. So Uncle is going to keep calling me that. So just so the world knows, that's who I am. Yeah. And I'm proud of it because it's my legacy.
Absolutely. And yes, and I mean, students would learn physics with no experiments. There's no material in the classroom to teach physics. So everything is taught, as far as some of the science subjects are concerned, are taught theoretically without any apparatus or anything like that. But they got the grades. Wow. And it's just amazing. We take so much for granted here. So we waste so much. So that's been a very seminal and a very powerful and life transforming decision I made when I went to work in Zambia for 4 years. I loved it, loved the country, and ate the food. Wow. Immersed myself in the culture, learned so much about Africa, and in the sense I call it the inverted triangle. It's we're slaves. Our ancestors were slaves taken from Africa to the Caribbean, and here the son of ex-slave that go far down and go back to contribute. It was just amazing. It must
be beautiful. That's amazing. I'm really proud of you, Uncle, for doing that, and then obviously becoming a teacher in the UK. And then what happened? What was the transition from going into teaching and then going into being a TV producer for one of the most respected broadcast associations in the world, the BBC? How did that happen? And you had a long stint.
Yeah, when I came back to England after Zambia, I taught in a secondary school in London, South London. I was assistant head of sixth form. So I used to take all the pupils through their A levels, and also taught at different parts of the school as well. And I left there education college, Kingsway College. Okay. Strangely enough, which is where I did my A levels. So I went back and taught there. It was quite interesting. So that was the teaching part of me. But at the same time, my brother, which is Bishop John Francis, your uncle, had started his group called the Inspirational Choir, and I was managing them at the time. So it's quite funny. The school thought something strange was going on. I used to have Rolls Royce picking me up after school because the record company was touting the choir, and you know what record company, they just sweeten up the decision maker, so they'd send the Rolls Royce for me to attend the meeting. So the school would say, "What on earth is going on with this guy here?" So things like that.
He's moonlighting.
Yes. Or we were very close to the group called Madness. So I used to bring Suggs into school. I used to bring Juna Giscombe into school. Yes, and give a talk. So it was quite fun. I was doing this duality. But then I left education because I wanted a new challenge, actually, and then got into television. I started off as a researcher on a television program. And then did the People Get Ready gospel series for Channel 4, and I worked in their factual departments and made factual programs for them. And then I was in New York on holiday one year, and I got a call. It's quite amazing. I've learned something. I got a call. I'm in somebody's fancy apartment, and the call came and it said, "For you." I said, "It can't be for me. Nobody knows I'm
here."
So the person said, "It is for you." I answered the call, and it was from the BBC, and said, "Mr. Francis, I'm the new editor of Songs of Praise. When you get back to England, I'd like you to come and see me." Anyhow, cut a long story short, I got the job to work as a producer for Songs of Praise. Now, because of that, Rene, I don't apply for jobs anymore.
No, you don't.
In television, I said, no, when they want you, they find you.
That's correct. And I remember, as I said, it was quite, what an exciting time for me growing up. I would turn on different channels and see different relatives. So Dad will be on Dad will be on BBC One because he's got his band. Then great uncle would be on Channel 4 because he had the gospel show, People Get Ready. And then BBC One, then you'll be on Songs of Praise. And I'll be at school trying to say, "Oh no, my mum and dad, my dad and my uncle." And they're like, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that before. Yes, definitely. Yes, it's all good.
No, it's amazing. And obviously that you've done loads of things with Songs of Praise, and most of I would say every UK pop act, R&B and gospel has gone on that program at some point, from Beverly Knight, all of them, every single one of them have had the opportunity.
It's a long list if I was beginning to mention many of those. And of course, then, as you know, I ended up staging a number of major gospel concerts and all that kind of stuff, and doing other freelance work for television.
Well, you actually, because you're not now shouting your trumpet, you gave the first, because I remember you was at Fairfield Hall. You did the first concert for Michelle Williams, which is in Destiny's Child, Beyonce.
In this country, yes.
Yes, you did.
First solo concert I did for her.
You did, I remember, and it was out of this world. As a youngster watching it, going, "Oh, wow!"
Yeah, that's true.
And the list is endless, from Trey Songz.
Trey Songz is interesting. Trey Songz is interesting because, as you know the story. But let me just tell this because your listeners and viewers might find it interesting. Now, of course, I knew nothing about what this guy. You have no idea who
it was. That was hilarious. Yeah.
I got a telephone call that would I be interested in filming and staging this American artist who is ripping up the scene, as it were. So I spoke to the people behind, and I said, "Yeah, okay, fine." So I agreed to do it. And I'm at home. The boys came in from school, and I said, "By the way, I've been asked to do a program with a singer called Trey Songz." Hassan, he said, "What do you say, Dad?" I said, this singer called Trey Songz, do you know him? He said, "Hang on a minute." He got his mobile phone and said, "Guess what? My dad is doing Trey Songz." Then I knew this guy was obviously somebody. Up until that point, I had no idea.
That's fantastic. And then obviously, Tracy Ellis Ross, you gave me that opportunity with the
You came on that, yes.
I came on that and performed for that. That was amazing.
Yes.
And,
Wendy Williams, because that's Wendy Williams had done before. I'd done her before as part of that series of programs. and won an award for a documentary I did on her, Wendy Williams in London. That was rather nice.
That's right. And then, well, no, so The Amazing Grace, I went to that film premiere. I was going to premieres when I was so young.
Forgot about
yeah, I had
that. Yes,
forgotten. That was my first premiere, Uncle. I was going to.
Was it really? All right.
It was my first premiere.
Yes.
And you.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Amazing Grace film. Yes.
Yeah.
Made by Walden Media in America. That was a good project. That's an excellent project.
It was powerful.
Yeah.
So, promotion from the BBC to being one of actually the biggest UK promoter in gospel. You've done Kirk Franklin, Fred Hammond, Mary, and the list goes on. Every singer that, that needs to owe their dues to you. Myself, you looked after me when I do my performances and shows. So it's just out of this world that what you've achieved. And now you're telling your story in a book. And the first book that you did, obviously this is not the first book, this is the second book. So the first book that you had out, that's done very well, and it's educated people in the music industry and the gospel industry, but they can still take it into the secular world too.
Yes, because it's about how to make the title, how to make gospel music work for you. But it's good as saying how to make music work for you. Because what I've done in the first book is show how artists, independent artists, can make a success of their music today in the social media, digital, internet age. In other words, I'm saying to gospel artists, I'm saying to artists, you don't need a record company anymore. If you've got one, great. But if you haven't got one, don't lose any sleep over it. You can still become successful. You can still earn a lot of money, but you've got to learn the few tricks and tricks rather of the trade. And a few things you've got to learn how the thing works. You need a new mindset. You need a new way of doing things. And you've got to get away from the idea of how record companies behave. And unfortunately, that's a very difficult lesson for artists to take, because they're so conditioned by the record company, what record company can do, and they're going to get a big advance, and the record company is going to come behind and throw money at them and all that kind of stuff. It's now very few artists they do that with now. Very few. So the book is for independent artists.
No, it's phenomenal.
Now you can do it yourself. And guess what? You make 80% of your own money.
That's right. Because we know when you sign to not knocking anyone who has, but when you sign to a major, everything is taken. You can't breathe. There's no creative control.
Was it 15 pence in every pound or something silly like that? Comes back to the artists that they make.
So that's powerful, and that's something that anyone that's inspiring to go into the industry needs to get involved in. But what's really exciting, we're in a very powerful year, as well as it's got its downsides because of COVID, but there's a lot of change. I call it, there's a shift in the atmosphere. And I was really excited. I got the opportunity to read your new book, which is the Windrush and the Black Pentecostal Church in Britain. I've got it right here. And it's phenomenal. I mean, this book is heavy, inspiring, insightful, and it fills in the gaps. Because a lot of people think they know the history. And I even got things wrong where I was like, I didn't understand that. Oh, that made sense. So it was very insightful, but also informative is the word. It gave me information that I hadn't ordinarily had. And Windrush has caused so much conversations over the last few years. It's come back up again. And when I read the book, I was like, oh, hold on a minute. We was invited. Then we was told, no, it's time to go home back. And then we're here again and we're been told to go back home again. It's like, what's going on? Very interesting. So the Windrush story, I mean, obviously we could be here for hours, but just give me a snippet, or people who don't know the story of the Windrush. It's very powerful, and what it meant to the Caribbeans coming over here.
The basic story is that in 1948, don't forget the Second World War finished in 1945. So it's 3 years afterwards. Britain was completely broken as an economy and as a country. It needed to develop. It needed to redevelop after the devastation of the Second World War. And it needed laborers. Most of the men were killed during the war. Women had helped out during the war, but as soon as the war finished, they went back home. They didn't want to go into work in the way that the society expected them to. Some did, but most wanted to go back home and raise their families whatsoever. So there was a huge and a massive shortage of labor. The government looked to the Caribbean, in particular the West Indies, in particular Jamaica, for workers. And it passed an act of parliament in 1948 setting out that anyone from its colonies, Britain, British colonies, those in the Caribbean and elsewhere, who wanted to come to Britain could do so, and in doing so, become British citizens.
That's correct. That's what it said.
So in 1948, a group of Caribbean West Indians came to Britain on a boat called Empire Windrush. And they were workers coming to Britain to help in the redevelopment of the country. Britain went into the Caribbean, recruited workers, they set up agencies, they paid people to come over here. In fact, the bus company, London Transport, paid Barbadians to come to London and took the fare back out of their wages. They did the same with nurses. And so the recruitment was for Caribbean people to come and help rebuild the country. And that was the reason why we were here. We were here and we were invited to be here. Now, it's a dual effect in our countries in the Caribbean. Economically, things were bad. There was a hurricane in '52 in Jamaica, and that triggered a lot of problems, a lot of economic deprivation. So people were looking for an opportunity. And when Britain opened its doors for people from the West Indies to come to England, from the Caribbean to come to England, people jumped on it. Your grandfather jumped on that idea, and the whole of his generation. Those group of people who came here at that time, those first crop, if you like, of Caribbeans who came in 1945 onward up to 1968, 70, they're called the Windrush generation. And it's named after the Windrush ship who took the first batch of Caribbean people to Britain after the Second World War in 1948.
Wow. And, I've seen the pictures and the footage, and they all were very smartly dressed and pinstripes.
Oh, yeah, they're dapper people, yes, yes, very much so.
Very well put together and very well defined. And they came here, and they had this thing about the streets were paved with gold. And they realized very quickly when they were trying to settle, I mean, you spoke about in the book, there was a time where they had to go underground and they couldn't leave there until, I mean, it was like, explain it. It was quite overwhelming to hear the story.
Well, the thing is, two things about that. There were those, when they first came, most Caribbean people had nobody to come to.
It's true.
They were invited here, they were invited to work, and the government had to put them up. They put them up, a lot of them, in London, in the bottom, in the grounds, the well of Clapham South Underground Station, which it has used in the Second War to house people because of the bombing. So a lot of the Caribbeans, that's where they first were placed when they came here. Now, it's interesting because Brixton is only a mile or so down the road, and that was where it's called the Labour Exchange in those days, but it's the job, what you call it, a job centre now. Yeah,
that's correct.
So they would leave there, Clapham South, go to Brixton, they'll get a job because jobs were plentiful. So I say in the book, they could leave there, be at the job centre by 8, 9 o'clock, and by 12 o'clock they're in a job.
I heard that.
So now it makes sense. Very quickly, they all found work. So they then left the underground accommodation and began to look for rented accommodation. And that's where they found a lot of the racism and a lot of the problem. Finding work wasn't the issue. There's plenty of work. Plenty of work. Mind you, a lot of them had to do low-skilled work because they just wouldn't give them skilled work, even though they were qualified, but they all could find work. There's enough work. Finding accommodation was very, very difficult. And there's some horror stories about what it was like with people trying to find somewhere to live and how people used to live. Some people used to work in the mornings and share their accommodation with those who work at night. They used to do a shift work and live in one room, as I say in the book, acted as place where you cook, place where you sleep, place where the children play. I mean, it was just horrendous. And it's all in the book. Yeah. I describe quite vividly what conditions was like for those early settlers, if I may use that term, to describe Caribbeans who came here.
And they had a thing which I remember growing up called a partner. It's maybe used in all cultures, but it's a way, because they couldn't get to a bank, they didn't have no bank accounts, they had no way of holding money, so they had to circulate money between them, and everyone would be paid out at different points of the month or year or something over a period of time.
The partner is actually an African savings device. It's called USU. Now, no banks would lend any Caribbean any money. No financial institution would lend them any money to purchase house or mortgages or anything. They were excluded from the financial system. Mind you, there weren't credit cards or any of that stuff back then. Yeah. So if you wanted to borrow any money for any purposes, you had to go to a bank or financial institution. You were excluded. But within the Caribbean community, they had a saving system called the partner. And I explain that in detail in the book. It's basically a saving system where a group of people, 10, 15, 20, 30 people, will pool a certain amount of money together every week. And every person at one stage would draw out the whole of that money, because it's a savings. And if they were on the early one, they pay it back. So at the end, everybody had access to the full amount, and they paid the full amount back. Now, what that did, that enabled a Caribbean person to have a sizable amount of money in their hands at any given time. So they could then deposit on a house because they've got the money. They could then bring their relatives from back home over because they've got money. They could then begin to buy cars and fancy clothes. And it used to upset the neighbors and upset all the white people in their areas, because here these guys just come over the other day and they're driving in fancy cars, buying houses and just living it up. But what they didn't know is how that money was made, how that money came about is through a partner system, a saving clubs. And it's that which bought all the houses, all that generation bought their own houses. And that generation bought their own churches, so that today the property portfolio of the West Indian or the Caribbean community is very, very high. Now people are inheriting houses that their grandparents bought that's now worth millions.
Because the locations we're thinking about.
They're all in London. Most of them in London or in the big cities. And in London and the big cities, house prices have gone up like crazy. You buy a house in Brixton 30 years ago, it's worth £1.5 million now.
It's crazy. That's ridiculous. If you think about it.
You couldn't get council properties. There's no way of going into council houses that weren't open to black people in those days. So you had to fend for yourself. You had to do things for yourself. You had to learn how to cope. You had to learn how to be self-sufficient. And we are a people who historically is a self-sufficient people.
Yes.
And we shouldn't lose that.
Back home, we had businesses. That's kind of how it was. Grandma, I remember she had a business when she came over here, didn't she? She had a little business on the side.
She had a shop. No, but that generation was self-sufficient. They relied on their own efforts. They weren't going to councils and all places about getting effort, because they weren't going to get it anyway. So necessity is the mother of invention, but they had that ingrained in them, so that through hard work and effort they would achieve, and they have. And they've left a great legacy in many respects for their grandchildren, especially in terms of property. The churches are just the same. There's so many churches in this country that valued so much money. They were bought. As I think I told you, I was shocked how which is your grandfather, how he was able to buy a property within 3 years of arriving in this country. I don't know how he did it. I'm sorry he's died. I can't ask him.
Yeah, because I don't know.
I don't know.
And paid it off.
Yeah. Well, how did he do this within 3 years? It's just impossible.
But there was a discipline. There's a discipline that generation had, and as you said, they were self-sufficient. And I think, you know, when you start looking at your life and what you're doing and achieving, you only have to give thanks to the foundation that was laid by them. And you can't dismiss that. You can't dismiss what work and how they had to pay tremendously to give us what we have right now. You know, there's so much to talk about, and I'm watching the time. You taught me something in the book, and I did know. Obviously, the transatlantic slave trade, we know, and it's part of our life, and it's our heritage, and we were taken from Africa and placed in different parts of the world. But it was really poignant when you spoke about the Industrial Revolution, the sugar trade versus the cotton trade, and the Caribbean and the African Americans. And I don't think people realize the system that was designed and how much different parts of the world have benefited from that. And you touched on it in the book, and it was quite powerful when I was reading it, because it just really makes you realize your journey, your story, and your foundation.
Yes, the British industrial success. This is not taught in school. I used to be a history teacher. I didn't teach it because it wasn't on the curriculum, and I wasn't taught it myself, so I had to learn it myself. British industrial success is based on cotton. Britain do not make cotton. Cotton came from the southern states of America, which meant that it was slaves who were harvesting, working on plantation that produced cotton, that came to Britain, that was spun into yarn, and Britain then sold it around the world and earned a fortune out of it, and was one of the successes of the Industrial Revolution. The whole of Lancashire, Manchester, all those here are major industrial areas that grew rich on cotton. The next was sugar. There was a saying in the late 18th century, as rich as a West Indian. If you were a West Indian plantation owner, you was incredibly rich. Sugar was like what oil is to the economy today. It was absolutely strategic to Britain's success because it's the plantation that created the sugar that was sold here, were bought and traded here, and then sold abroad, and made Britain very rich. The big places, the big cities like Bristol, Birmingham, Liverpool, London grew rich out of sugar. Yes, because the demand for sugar was so great that Britain had the plantation, and the plantation produced the sugar which Britain could sell abroad and earn a fortune for. Now, the last thing on that, which many people didn't know, when slavery ended in 1832, the plantation owners were compensated for the loss of their slaves. The equivalent money in today's money would be 70 billion pounds. The slaves got not 1 penny. The government, after the brutalization of all the slaves on the plantation to produce sugar for Britain to make Britain rich, it ended up compensating the slave owners, and the slave got not a single penny. Fact.
Got to kind of take that in. Gets you quite choked.
Yes, terrible.
And then think of some of the organizations that we see today that are based on, I didn't even realize Tate Modern had the background to the sugar.
Yeah.
It's only when you stop and think about it. You
Tate and Lyle.
Tate and Lyle. It's overwhelming, and it almost feels like you're in a dream sometimes when you hear the story, because you can't get your head around it. It's almost this is actually our journey, and a lot of people of color's journey. And it's just, wow, it blows your mind, and it blows my mind every time I hear it, even though I know.
Yeah.
It just makes me very
We must read and learn it. We must read it up and learn it and tell our children it, so that we constantly aware of where we come from, the struggles that we've gone through, the price, the sacrifices that we've made to make this country what it is. So we have a right here. We have a right to everything that Britain offers, because we made Britain as much as Britain made itself. In fact, in the book, I say that Africans were here before the English. Fact.
Yeah.
Africans were in Britain before the English. Fact. That's a thought for you, isn't it?
It's really a thought. There's I say history untold. History untold. This is a powerful book, guys. I think, as I said, you need to read it. It filled in gaps to me that I know and I've read, and I'm a researcher and I've read books over the time. But when you start really all piecing it together, it's actually very powerful. Very powerful. Okay, well, the church scene. Now, I remember growing up, and I had the privilege out of all of the grandchildren to be in the church, which was the church, the White Lion Street Church in Islington. And it was all a bit overwhelming as a child, being in church with all what was happening and everyone getting into spirit and tambourines going. I never understood it. And then obviously reading the book, it really highlighted the different areas and churches and how things were formed, what all these different areas of the church service meant. It's so much more to it than just what I would experience. And it was amazing how you broke it down from the moment you walk into the church, the praise and worship, all the stages of when they give themselves to Christ at the end. And I laugh because I giggle because I've seen things have happened around you.
It. Yeah, you know it.
So that was amazing how you spoke about the different denominations in the churches and the background to it. I didn't realize. And you can just touch on that when we speak about the origins of all the different denominations that we now know today. Pentecostalism, Seventh-day Adventists. It's not what I thought it was.
Yeah. Very briefly, most Caribbean people came here in the early days, belonged to the established churches in the Caribbean. They were essentially Anglicans. The majority were not Pentecostals. The majority were Anglicans. They belonged to the Anglican Church. They were Baptists. They were Methodists and Seventh-day Adventists. Okay. A group of them was Pentecostals, but the majority was Anglican. So when they came here the first Sunday, they rolled up locally to their local church, as they do in the Caribbean. Everybody goes to church in Jamaica on a Sunday. Still do to this day. They go to the bar afterwards, but they go to church first.
Yes, they do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. So they rolled up to church. And of course, these poor white folks seeing these black people coming for the first time, it's kind of unnerved a lot of them. And of course, these people were made to feel unwelcome. They were shunned, and some were told not to come back because their presence was upsetting the white congregation. Now, last week Sunday, I was in a service. The Pentecostal Credit Union, which was started by a colleague called Carmel Jones, he's now 86.
Wow.
He went to a church in Clapham, and 65 years ago, the vicar told him not to come back because he was upsetting his congregation. Today, last Sunday, the present vicar of this church, the same church, heard about this story and decided to hold a service of forgiveness.
Oh, wow.
I went to that service last Sunday. Everybody was in tears. It was just absolutely, it was a service of absolution and forgiveness. The minister cried.
Really?
I couldn't believe it. White folks do not cry in public. I'm not amazed at it. It's impossible. But he was so moved by what had happened 65 years ago. Now, Carmel Jones made a success of his life because he now runs the Pentecostal Credit Union, which is a big established credit union. In fact, the second biggest credit union in the country, period. So So that's what happened to those who belonged to the established church when they first came in. Pentecostals didn't have that experience. Your grandfather and others didn't have that experience. What they did, they went and found other Pentecostals and decided to keep prayer meetings, keep the churches in people's homes. So your grandfather's church began in the front room of his house in Berriman Road in North London. From there, they had prayer meetings on a Wednesday and a Friday. Then it became Sunday service in the front room. When that got too big, they went hired hall. And when that got too big, a hired hall, they then bought their own building. That's why your grandfather was one of the first person to buy a church, a Black Pentecostal preacher to buy a church in Britain. So that's how that happened. Now, whilst this was happening, over the years, a number of churches began to establish themselves in Britain. In Jamaica and the Caribbean, the Church of God, the New Testament Church of God existed. Yeah. The Church of God of Prophecy existed. The Seventh-day Adventists existed. So when people came here from the Caribbean, from these churches, they looked for those similar churches. If they didn't find a Church of God of Prophecy or New, they started one. They started one here. So that began the growth of the different Pentecostal churches in this country. The first one in this country was started by a woman. Her name is Rene McClurkin. It's funny, the first Black Pentecostal church in this country was started by a woman in Navarina Road in North London. Mother McClurkin, she started that. Her husband came 4 years later. She came to England before her husband. That's something a lot of people don't know. A lot of women came to Britain from Jamaica before their husband. There was a lot of women who came here. 252 women came on that boat. Single women, or some who were married as well. But they came and left the men folks behind. Yeah. She started the church. 4 years later, her husband came and took it over. So it's interesting. It's good to know that the first Black Pentecostal church in this country started by a woman. And women's played a magnificent and a very important part in the church ever since. So when you used to go to your grandfather's church and see all that stuff going on, it was all exciting, interesting, and it just washed over your head. I thought it's important to try and tabulate that and explain what was happening, what happens through each aspect, each part of the service, even the music. People came with their own music from the Caribbean. Yeah, so in your grandfather's church in the old days, they'd have trumpet, banjo, guitar, Hawaiian guitar, all kinds of instruments. And the music was a mixture of Jamaican folk, like a bit of merengue, a bit of this. Blue beat was not allowed, which was the prevailing Jamaican music, because that's secular music. It wouldn't have that. So they came with the music. In 69 rather, everything changed. Because in 1969, Edwin Hawkins released Oh Happy Day, and that changed everything, because that was the beginning of gospel music. So there became an affinity, a relationship between the churches in London and the churches in America, and the music began to fuse. So Caribbean music then morphed into American gospel music, and out of that it synthesized into a music we have today called British gospel music.
Okay. And that's the relationship that the two countries have had. Wow.
Correct. And they still have today, to this day. And interestingly enough, the major churches in this country, the major Caribbean churches, their headquarters are in America. Church of God of Prophecy headquarters is in America. New Testament Church of God headquarters in America. And in the late 60s and 70s, the first generation, my generation, we all went off to America. Yeah, we all went off to America. And it's interesting because America was happening. Black America was happening in those days in a way that Black Britain wasn't happening. So we used to look to America. And all the women, all the young Black girls wanted to marry American men. Yeah, because
still do.
They were excited. They still do. Because they were exciting. We were bored. Yeah, because nothing was happening. You know, Americans had politicians, they had lawyers, they had professional people, they had people in government, they had people in films, Sidney Poitier and all that. Yeah, films, on the television. Whereas in Britain, we had nothing like that.
No.
Absolutely nothing like that. Now, we've come a long way in a short time, because we now have those, and it's now increasing. But in those days, it didn't. So we looked to America for a lot of things. And that's why there's a big relationship between the churches in Britain and the churches in America, black churches in America.
It's really, I mean, we could talk forever, and I think our hour's nearly up, Uncle. It's been amazing. Wow. Okay, so how can they, is the question, how can they get the book, which is called The Windrush and the Black Pentecostal Church in Britain? Where do they need to go to purchase
the best place to get the book is from my website,
okay.
royfrancis.co.uk. www.royfrancis.co.uk.